Hi there. Today we'll be talking about the upsurge in activism in the 1960s. This discussion ought to cover more movements and ideas than it will, including the anti-Vietnam War movement and the student-centered counterculture, as well as the three huge movements that began in the 1960s but came to national prominence in the 1970s and 80s, that being the women's movement, the gay rights movement, and the American Indian movement, and of course the civil rights movement. We're going to look at two of these, the civil rights movement and the women's movement. But before we get there, I want to mention a couple of overarching themes. The dominant narrative of the 1960s activism has been much the same as that about the anti-war movement, the narrative of rise and fall. In emphasizing this narrative, historians followed the sources. People involved in this movement, even in the 1960s, were talking about the progression from heady optimism, which you can see here to the left in the free speech movement in Berkeley at the 60s, to cynical frustration, which you can see here with the Kent State shootings on the right, which sometimes gave way to outright radicalism or even insanity, which you can see in the middle with Charles Manson's scary eye. The theory being that if you can't change stuff by talking about it, you might have to take more stringent or more violent measures. The advantage of this narrative of rise and fall, where things started out optimistic and then ended up terribly, is that it accurately conveys how many people felt about things. The disadvantage is that it doesn't step back to consider context. It struggles to consider whether the events of the period, say the 1960s, were manifestations of or were affected by larger processes. That narrative has been challenged in numerous ways in recent years. One challenge, which we'll perhaps touch on later in this course, advances the idea that the 1960s weren't actually a radical decade at all, but rather a conservative one. It began, of course, with the election of the fierce anti-communist John F. Kennedy, after all, and ended with the election of another fierce anti-communist, Richard Nixon. How might the story of 1960s activism change if the activists are in the minority? Or does it change at all? A second major challenge to the rise and fall narrative concerns mass culture. If the rise and fall narrative is compelling, part of its appeal lies in its democratic, grassroots nature, where people rebelled authentically against one oppressive system or another. But historians have begun to notice that many of the countercultural activities of the 1960s took place against a cultural backdrop that fetishized and commodified dissent. You can see this here in the 1950s, long before most of the activists of the 60s got going. James Dean's movie Rebel Without a Cause. Whether the counterculture successfully refuted bourgeois or capitalist ways, historians have noted that it might be appropriate to tell the story of the 1960s as part of the wider history of capitalism and mass culture, which long ago learned how to include resistance to itself as part of its wider sales pitch. You can see here the adorable Pepsi Cola ad encouraging people to, stick it to the man by giving money to a major multinational corporation. The point here is not to denounce hippies as sellouts, but to think in more sophisticated ways about what their movement meant to them, what its appeal was to others, and what its wider implications were. As you approach your documents, think about both the terms various activists described their ambitions in and the context in which those ambitions operated. The civil rights movement, the largest and perhaps most significant grassroots movement of the 20th century, is in some ways an exception to the decline and fall narrative. At least partially so, because unlike the others, it didn't emerge from the 1960s. Instead, it sprang from a surge of national grassroots activism that stretches back before these other movements gained prominence in the national consciousness, or in some cases even existed. Some historians have even tried, and I think you're capable of seeing how they might, to envision the movement stretching all the way back to at least the Great Depression. So it might not fit the same economic and political parameters that the other movements hit. Still, as you can sense from these pictures, the story of civil rights in the 1960s and 1970s has been painted with the same rise and fall brush. Regardless, the first historians who wrote about the civil rights movement frequently focused on national leaders and national developments. This led to probing searches of the characters and motives of figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, seen here, and to a general sense that the movement split along political and chronological lines. The first part of the movement, in the early 1960s and late 50s, characterized by King's politics, and the second, from 1968 onward, characterized by Malcolm's. Historians also started out focusing on national strategies, with the result that the strategies of these national leaders, like King and Malcolm, came to stand for the whole movement. So some of the memory of the movement has been marked by their strategies of engaging the national media, and by others, such as the NAACPs and Thurgood Marshalls, who's fourth from the right here, in trying to make changes in the law at the national level, as he did in Brown versus Board. But more recently, people have filled in the picture, digging into the way that the movement functioned at the grassroots level and in local politics. There, scholars have found, local organizers sometimes outpaced national leaders in their radicalism, or, conversely, offered visions of political cooperation that those leaders' programs of civil disobedience didn't fit. They also found that change frequently didn't come from the top down. You've probably heard the myth that Rosa Parks was just tired and refused to give up her seat for that reason. But she was a secretary in the NAACP, and what she was tired of might well have been the slow policies of the male leadership in her own movement. She and other women frequently pushed leaders in the movement to move forward when they might not have done so on their own impetus. I fear that our documents won't allow you to interrogate this question as deeply as I'd like them to, but it's extremely important to keep them in mind. In a development that you'll be better able to examine with our documents, historians have also integrated the story of the civil rights movement into the national political narratives. Most particularly, I'll ask you to think about the impact of the Cold War on the movement. Historians have argued that pressure from the Soviets might have been a more potent factor than others in convincing American politicians to accede to the demands of civil rights activists. Others have suggested that the ideological pressures of being involved in a war supposedly and explicitly for freedom and equality spurred American politicians and lawyers to conceive of a constitutional right to equality. This would provide a cudgel for activists to use against political opponents, and an opportunity for skittish but tolerant politicians to climb on board. Reading documents from people in positions of power, you might consider what they were responding to, moral suasion or geopolitical imperatives, and whether those spurs to action might have altered the way they went about enacting civil rights legislation and jurisprudence. The women's movement also partakes of the rise and fall narrative, a bit later in time than the civil rights and anti-war movements, but still. You can see how that narrative might function in popular culture, going from the powerful business-minded activism of Kate Millett and early women's liberation theorists to the infantilized objectification of Britney Spears in the 1990s. Part of the way that this progression has been conceived of relates to one of the organizing ideas of the women's movement, which is that there was a women's culture, a set of experiences common to all women that could unite them into a single group. I'll ask you to think about whether or not that was or is true, and borne out by our documents. Some historians have argued that part of the backlash against the women's movement in the 1980s, and it was a severe backlash, stemmed from the fact that politics and cultural signifiers that leaders of the movement adopted did not reflect the needs or desires of many women. You might think particularly about abortion in these terms, but think as well about the terms of other parts of the movement relating to work and other facets of life. More recently, and influenced by what has come to be called third-wave feminism, historians have tried to consider the way feminism affected or failed to affect women of color, lower-class women, and queer people. Were the feminists of the 1970s replacing one set of gender hierarchies with another cultural and economic one, or unwittingly perpetuating the same hierarchies in a different way, This might be true if you think the patriarchy can't exist independent of class domination, for instance. But perhaps the decline of a unitary movement was the impetus to open up feminism to a wider constituency, the way that it may have been doing in recent years. Each of the movements we'll be talking about seems to have reached a point of cultural prominence and then faded, often in the face of a massive backlash. You might think about all aspects of this process and consider what it reveals about the movements and the culture they were trying to change. Did the movements recede because of internal struggles or failures of ideas? Did the backlashes they inspired reflect those failures? Or did the backlashes reveal instead how necessary the movements were in the first place? The idea being that only something that challenges a power structure where it hurts will inspire such a powerful reaction. Regardless, think hard about what these movements reveal about the nature of democracy and about the leanings of American society and about how change comes when it comes.